At exactly 9:42 on the morning of September 15th, 1944, Corporal Jack Miller crouched within the jagged, blood-stained white coral of the Umerbrogol pocket, witnessing a scene of calculated murder that would haunt his dreams for decades. The heat on the island of Peleliu had already ascended to a staggering 115 degrees Fahrenheit, manifesting as a wet, suffocating blanket that caused the very air to shimmer and distort like boiling water over a stovetop. Yet, Jack did not feel the oppressive temperature. He was insulated by a cold, crystalline focus. He felt only the razor-sharp edges of the volcanic coral digging into his bruised knees and the rhythmic, heavy thud of Japanese mortar rounds, walking their way up the valley floor with terrifying mathematical precision. Roughly 400 yards ahead, the once lush jungle had been utterly stripped away by days of relentless naval gunfire, leaving behind a desolate, alien moonscape of scorched white rock and suffocating black ash. Standing atop a limestone ridge, positioned exactly 800 yards to the north, was the man responsible for this systematic butchery. The Japanese officer stood in plain sight, a silhouette of imperial defiance that defied every rule of survival on this hellish island. He was not seeking cover, nor was he crawling through the filth or pressing his body into the safety of a reinforced concrete bunker. Instead, he stood tall and stationary, wearing a pressed, olive-drab uniform that looked impossibly clean against the grim, gray backdrop of the ridge. In his left hand, he held a pair of high-powered binoculars, and in his right, a leather map case. To the exhausted, bleeding Marines of the 1st Division who were huddled in the dirt, this man appeared less like a soldier and more like a vengeful ghost or a dark god of the mountain. With a slow, deliberate motion, he would raise his hand, point a gloved finger toward a specific cluster of rocks, and precisely 10 seconds later, a Japanese mortar team hidden on the reverse slope would drop a high-explosive shell directly on top of a Marine fire team. He was conducting a horrific orchestra of violence with absolute, chilling impunity. This officer was not merely lucky. He was a master of the terrain who knew exactly where the Americans were pinned down. And more crucially, he possessed a lethal understanding of the technical limitations of the weapons they carried. In 1944, the standard American infantry rifle was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic masterpiece of engineering that was rugged, reliable, and capable of firing 8 rounds of .22, 30-06 ammunition as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. It was the backbone of the American war effort. But the Garand had a definitive, unyielding physical limit. Its effective range for a standard infantryman was roughly 500 yards. Beyond that threshold, the thick iron sights of the rifle would completely obscure a human-sized target, and the aerodynamics of the bullet would cause it to tumble and drift unpredictably in the Pacific winds. The Japanese officer was standing at 800 yards, a distance he had calculated with cold-blooded logic. He knew he was untouchable. He could have theoretically set up a lawn chair and smoked a cigarette in total tranquility, knowing that the angry buzzing of American bullets would fall hopelessly short, splashing harmlessly into the ravine below him. He was using his own physical safety as a psychological weapon, mocking the men who had not slept in 3 days, taunting them with the reality of their own helplessness. Jack watched through narrowed eyes as the officer pointed once more. A heartbeat later, a puff of gray smoke erupted near a machine gun nest to Jack's left. A scream sliced through the heavy, humid air high, thin, and desperate before being drowned out by the frantic, guttural shouts for a corpsman. The Marines in the trench slammed their fists into the unforgiving coral in a fit of helpless, white-hot rage. They fired their Thompson submachine guns and their M1 carbines in the general direction of the ridge. But it was a pathetic waste of precious ammunition. The bullets didn't even cover half the distance before gravity claimed them. The Japanese officer didn't even flinch at the sound of the American fire. He didn't even deign to look down at the men he was killing. He simply adjusted his spectacles, checked his map with the air of a scholar, and prepared to call in the next devastating strike. The Marine captain nearby shouted into the radio, his voice cracking as he demanded immediate artillery support. But the only response was the crackle of static and the distant roar of other battles. The batteries were either suppressed, the coordinates were lost in the chaos, or the shells had simply run out. For the moment, the infantry was entirely on its own. It was then that Jack turned his back on the ridge and dragged a long, heavy canvas case out from beneath a scorched tarp. The case was slick with mold and coated in wet sand, but as he unbuckled the leather straps, the contents revealed themselves to be in pristine, factory condition. He pulled out a weapon that looked like a relic from a different era, something that belonged in a museum or perhaps a precision shooting gallery rather than the mud of Palayu. It was a 1903 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle that had seen its prime during the First World War. However, it wasn't the rifle itself that caused the surrounding men to stop cleaning their wounds and stare in stunned silence. It was the massive optic mounted on top of the receiver. The scope was an Unertello 8-power target optic, and it was gargantuan. The steel tube measured 24 inches in length, nearly as long as the rifle barrel itself. It sat high above the receiver on delicate, precision-machined aluminum mounts that looked far too fragile for the rigors of amphibious warfare. It didn't look like a tool of combat. It looked like a piece of sensitive laboratory equipment, a fragile glass pipe that might shatter if a soldier so much as sneezed near it. It featured enormous, knurled adjustment knobs for windage and elevation that protruded like the ears of a strange mechanical beast. Most peculiar of all was the external recoil spring. The scope was not fixed in place, but was designed to slide forward and backward within its mounts, with every shot to absorb the violent energy of the rifle. This was a complex, over-engineered piece of machinery designed for the sole purpose of shooting paper targets on the manicured lawns of Camp Perry, Ohio. The men in the trench looked at the strange rifle, then at Jack, and then they began to laugh. It was a dark, bitter, hollow laughter born of exhaustion and cynicism. A veteran sergeant spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the white rock and asked if Jack was planning to study the stars or perhaps hunt for butterflies in the middle of a massacre. He called the rifle a mail-order toy and predicted that the glass tube would fog up within 5 minutes in the tropical humidity, or that the first grain of coral grit would jam the delicate sliding mechanism. He told Jack to put the toy away and pick up a real rifle before he got himself killed by a sniper who wasn't playing games. These men had spent weeks fighting in the claustrophobic darkness of caves and spider holes, engaging the enemy at ranges of 10 feet or less. To them, the idea of a precision instrument in this meat grinder was not just impractical, it was offensive. Jack ignored the taunts. He understood their skepticism because he knew what they saw, a finicky, high-maintenance liability. But Jack possessed a different perspective. He saw the only weapon on the entire island capable of bridging the 800-yard gap between the trench and that ridge. The Marine Corps had purchased these Unertel scopes before the war for their competitive shooting teams, intended for use in the polite silence of national matches. When the war broke out, the Corps had dusted them off, bolted them onto select, high-accuracy rifles, and handed them to men who had proven they could hold their breath and control their heartbeat under extreme pressure. There was no manual for maintaining a floating lens system during a monsoon, and the experts in Washington had dismissed the setup as a temporary, stopgap solution. To the average grunt, it was a joke, but to a marksman, it was a scalpel. Jack set the rifle down on a stack of rotting sandbags with the tenderness one might show a newborn child. He wiped a microscopic smudge of oil from the ocular lens using a specialized dry cloth kept in a waterproof pouch. He checked the mounts, tightening the thumb screws with agonizing precision. Because the scope was so long, he couldn't simply rest the gun on a rock. The tube would strike the obstacle before the barrel, ruining the shot. He had to meticulously build a custom firing platform, stacking ammunition crates and sandbags to provide the necessary clearance for the massive optics. The sergeant continued to watch, shaking his head in disbelief, muttering that the Japanese officer would be long gone by the time Jack finished his science project. He argued that war wasn't a math problem to be solved with a slide rule. But Jack knew, with a certainty that bordered on the religious, that war at this range was exactly a math problem. It was a cold calculation of trajectories, velocities, and atmospheric variables. The target was 800 yards away. The .30 caliber bullet would exit the muzzle at 800 feet per second. But the moment it left the barrel, gravity would begin its relentless, invisible pull. Over that vast distance, the bullet would not travel in a straight line. It would describe a massive arc, falling out of the sky like a stone dropped from a skyscraper. Jack performed the ballistics math in his head. At 800 yards, the bullet would drop more than 100 inches below the point of aim. To hit the officer in the chest, Jack would have to aim nearly 9 feet above the man's head, effectively lobbing the round into the air and trusting gravity to deliver it to its destination. Jack finally lay down behind the rifle, pulling the walnut stock firmly into the pocket of his shoulder. He felt the familiar, solid weight of the wood, a grounding sensation amidst the chaos. He pressed his cheek against the comb and peered through the glass. In an instant, the world rushed toward him with startling clarity. The 8-power magnification sliced through the distance, erasing the shimmering heat waves and the drifting cordite smoke. Suddenly, the Japanese officer was no longer a tiny, blurred figure on a remote ridge. He was right there, seemingly close enough to touch. Jack could see the individual brass buttons on the officer's tunic, the glint of the sun on his binoculars, and the beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. He could see the movement of the man's jaw as he barked orders to the mortar crews below. The mockery from the trench died away into a heavy silence. The laughter of the sergeant no longer carried any weight. The only reality that remained was the fine black crosshair floating within the glass tube, centered on a man who believed himself to be a god. The officer on the ridge turned his head, appearing to look directly down the valley, staring straight toward Jack's hidden position. He saw only a pile of debris and dead trees, his gaze passing over the Marine without a hint of recognition. He smiled a confident, arrogant smirk that radiated the absolute certainty of a master of the battlefield. He began to raise his hand once more, preparing to signal another devastating mortar volley that would surely claim more American lives. He felt safe. He felt untouchable. He was 800 yards away, and in his mind, there was no American rifle in existence that could reach across that void to punish him. Jack reached up with his right hand and adjusted the elevation knob on the top of the scope. Click, click, click. The sound was crisp, mechanical, and infinitely precise. A tiny, deliberate noise in a world defined by the roar of explosions. He dialed in the range, compensating for the 100-inch drop. He then checked the wind, observing the way the smoke from a burning palm tree drifted across the valley floor. The air was moving from left to right at approximately 5 miles per hour. He reached for the windage knob. Click, click. The crosshair shifted almost imperceptibly to the left. Jack took a deep, steadying breath, feeling his lungs expand against the hard, unforgiving coral. He let half the air out, slowing his heart rate, and held the rest. The world around him seemed to go silent, the sounds of battle fading into a dull, distant hum. The Japanese officer was still smiling, his hand frozen at the apex of his gesture, an emblem of hubris. Jack's finger began its slow, deliberate take-up on the trigger. He wasn't just aiming a rifle, he was launching a physical manifestation of American resolve across a gap that logic said could not be crossed. He was about to demonstrate to the officer, and to the doubting men in his own trench, that the distance between life and death was exactly the length of a well-calculated curve. It was time to show the enemy what unreachable really meant, and to prove that a training rifle, in the hands of a man who understood the math of the kill, was the most dangerous thing on Peleliu. The hammer was ready to fall, and the silence of the moment felt heavier than the explosions that had preceded it. In the next heartbeat, the 800-yard myth of safety would be shattered forever. The trigger on the 1903 Springfield did not simply pull, It surrendered with the sudden, crystalline finality of a thin rod of glass snapping under surgical pressure. It was a sensation of absolute, terrifying precision, crisp, immediate, and hauntingly light. There was no preparatory creep, no tactile grit to warn the finger of the impending explosion, only the instantaneous release of the firing pin spring that sent the striker home. When the primer ignited, the rifle did not merely recoil, it slammed back into Jack's shoulder with a raw, primal violence that seemed to defy the laws of controlled machinery, surprising him with its prehistoric ferocity every single time he engaged. It was a sharp, angry kick, a jagged mechanical punch, far more punishing than the rhythmic, gas-operated shove of an M1 Garand. Yet, as the wood bit into his flesh, Jack remained oblivious to the deep, plum-colored bruise already blooming against his collarbone. He was a man possessed. His entire universe narrowed to the circular confines of the optic. This was the specific, harrowing moment that the standard infantrymen, with their mass-produced semi-automatics, could never truly comprehend. To them, a scope was a luxury, a mere magnifying glass crudely glued to a weapon of war. They possessed no understanding of the complex ballet of the slide. As the rifle discharged, the laws of Newtonian physics dictated a violent separation of components, while the wooden stock was driven backward into Jack's frame. The heavy, precision-engineered steel tube of the unconventional scope, governed by its own massive inertia, fought to remain stationary in space. The result was a bizarre, jarring spectacle, where the scope actually slid forward within its aluminum mounting rings, traversing nearly 3 inches along the length of the barrel, like a piston on a high-pressure steam engine. To an untrained observer, it looked as though the weapon was catastrophically disintegrating in the shooter's hands. Had Jack been utilizing a modern proper fixed-mount optic, this savage recoil would have driven the steel eyepiece directly into his orbital socket, blinding him instantly in a spray of blood and shattered bone. But the Unital was designed for survival. It slid away from his face, absorbing the kinetic trauma and insulating the delicate, hand-ground lenses from the brutal, bone-shaking energy of the 30-06 cartridge. Jack kept his eye pressed firmly against the protective rubber eyepiece, his breathing shallow and disciplined. With the practiced fluidity of a ghost, he reached up and manually drew the scope back into battery, sliding it rearward until it seated with a definitive, metallic click into its starting position. This was a ritual of muscle memory, a lethal choreography practiced 10,000 times in the humid shadows. Shoot, slide, reset the bolt. He did not blink. He could not afford the luxury of a single shutter of his eyelids, for the bullet was still a traveler in the air, leaving the muzzle at a staggering velocity of 800 feet per second. The copper-jacketed round tore through the first few hundred yards almost instantaneously, but as it transitioned into the open valley, the invisible hand of the atmosphere began its relentless sabotage. Aerodynamic drag clawed at the projectile, bleeding away its momentum, while the invisible tether of gravity dragged it inexorably toward the tropical Earth. It took a full 4 seconds for the bullet to traverse the 800-yard expanse of the limestone valley. To a civilian, 4 seconds is a mere heartbeat, a negligible flicker of time, but in the high-stakes vacuum of a long-range engagement, 4 seconds is an agonizing eternity. It is a window wide enough to take a full, steadying breath. It is a chasm of time deep enough for a man to doubt his mathematics, his windage, and his very soul. It is more than enough time for a target to bend down, perhaps to adjust a bootlace or swat a fly, and in doing so, render the most perfect shot in the world a futile waste of lead. Jack watched the distant ridge through the magnified circle of light, his world reduced to a shimmering, two-dimensional plane. The Japanese officer was still there, a tiny figure of authority frozen in the lens. He was smiling, caught in the middle of a sentence, his hand raised with regal confidence to point toward the American Marine lines. And then, The complex physics equation Jack had calculated in the dirt finally solved itself. The officer did not fly backward. He did not perform the dramatic, cinematic flail of a movie stuntman. He simply ceased to be a standing man. It looked as though an invisible puppeteer had reached down and severed the strings of a marionette. The officer folded inward, his body collapsing upon itself before dropping straight down behind the jagged limestone lip of the ridge. The pink mist that snipers whispered about in the mess tents was not visible at this extreme distance. Not even through the 8-power magnification of the unreal. There was only the sudden, jarring absence of a human being, the vacuum left behind by a man who, seconds prior, had been playing the role of a god. The thunderous crack of the shot finally rolled back across the valley. A flat, heavy report that echoed off the ancient coral walls like a hammer striking an anvil. Then came the silence, an absolute, suffocating silence that felt heavier than the heat. On the reverse slope, the Japanese mortar crew stood paralyzed, waiting for a command that would never be uttered. To their left, a Nambu machine gun team ceased fire, their rhythm broken by the inexplicable disappearance of their leader. In the American trenches, the atmosphere had shifted from mockery to a stunned, religious awe. The Marines who had spent the last 10 minutes jeering at Jack's toy rifle were frozen like statues. They lowered their binoculars, their eyes darting between the empty ridge and the strange, long-barreled relic resting on the sandbags. The grizzled sergeant, who had earlier expressed his disdain by spitting tobacco juice near Jack's boots, stood up with agonizing slowness, his jaw hanging slightly slack. He looked out at the impossible distance, then back at the skinny kid with the glass pipe mounted to his gun. The mockery did not just fade, it evaporated, replaced by a look of profound confusion that slowly hardened into a terrifying, lethal respect. Jack did not celebrate the kill. He did not seek the validation of a high five or a nod of approval. His focus remained internal, tethered to the machine. He reached for the bolt handle, navigating the primary drawback of the 1903 Springfield, its deliberate slowness. Unlike the Garand, which allowed for rapid, semi-automatic follow-up shots, this bolt-action ancestor demanded physical labor. One had to manually unlock the breech, drag the spent, smoking casing from the chamber, and shove a fresh round home. Jack worked the action with the heel of his palm, a smooth, rhythmic motion born of necessity. The empty brass cartridge spun out of the chamber, singing as it pinged against the sun-baked coral rock. Clack, clack. He drove a fresh round into the dark throat of the chamber and locked the bolt down with a final, decisive thud. He was ready to kill again. But the target had vanished into the earth. Now began the true psychological war. While the vindication of the hit was sweet, the reality of maintaining such a weapon in the hellscape of Peleliu was a bitter, unrelenting task. The Unertel scope was a miracle of mid-century optics, but it was a nightmare of delicate engineering, never intended for the rigors of amphibious assault. It was secured to the rifle by two fragile aluminum mounts that relied on tiny, spring-loaded plungers to maintain a zero alignment. Every time the heavy 30-0-6 fired, these mounts endured a mechanical earthquake. If Jack so much as bumped the scope against a jagged rock, if he fumbled it during a crawl, or if he even rested the weight of the rifle too heavily against a tree branch, the alignment would shift. A microscopic deviation of 1/1000th of an inch at the mounting point translated into a miss of several feet at the 800-yard mark. While the infantrymen carried rifles that could be used as clubs or baseball bats in a desperate melee, Jack was cradling a scientific instrument that demanded the obsessive care of a newborn infant. He reached into his sweat-soaked pocket and pulled out a small, tattered notebook, his dope book. This was the literal brain of the rifle, a chaotic ledger filled with scribbles, ballistic tables, and hand-drawn diagrams. The Unertel did not possess modern, magical markings to dictate aim. It featured only a crosshair made of actual spider silk, literally, the silk of a spider, chosen by the factory because it was finer and more resilient than any metal wire the era could produce. To hit a target, Jack had to manually dial the external knobs of the scope. He consulted his charts with the intensity of a mathematician. The tropical temperature was climbing, and with it, the heat shimmer. The mirage was beginning to distort the air. Hot air is less dense than cold air, a physical fact that meant the bullet would encounter less resistance, flying slightly faster and dropping less than it had only an hour before. He had to compensate for the very atmosphere itself. He reached up, his fingers steady, and turned the elevation knob 2 precise clicks downward. Click, click. In that small movement, he was accounting for the weather, the barometric pressure, and even the rotational velocity of the Earth. He was managing variables that the other Marines didn't even know existed in the physical world. The Japanese forces were not foolish. They understood that their officer hadn't simply tripped on the rocks. They knew a shot had originated from the American lines, but they were gripped by a profound tactical confusion. They were intimately familiar with the effective range of the American M1 Garand and the Browning automatic rifle. They knew that the jagged, bleached white rocks where Jack lay hidden were situated well outside the lethal envelope of standard infantry fire. They initially assumed it was a statistical anomaly, a lucky stray round from a heavy machine gun, or a fragment from a fortunate mortar strike. They did not yet realize they were being systematically hunted by a ghost with a telescope. They made the fatal error of believing the danger was a passing shadow. 3 minutes later, a Japanese non-commissioned officer, driven by duty and a desperate need to assess the situation, crawled toward the lip of the ridge. He was cautious, keeping his profile low against the limestone, but he committed one final, terminal mistake. He paused to peer through the fallen officer's binoculars, exposing his head and shoulders for a mere 5 seconds. Jack was already there, waiting in the silence. He had pre-aimed the rifle at the exact coordinate where the first man had fallen, his crosshair hovering like a predator over the white stone. When the curved silhouette of the helmet appeared, Jack didn't need to recalculate the mathematics of death. He simply squeezed the glass rod trigger once more. The second shot cracked through the humid, heavy air with the same authority as the first. The recoil slide kicked forward. The scope reset, and the NCO never heard the supersonic crack of the round that claimed him. The heavy, .30 caliber projectile punched through the steel helmet as if it were parchment, knocking the man backward off the ridge and into the void. 2 shots, 2 kills, both at a distance of half a mile. This time, the reaction in the American trench was not one of confusion, but of frantic, focused energy. The sergeant did not stare. He scrambled over the sharp rocks and knelt beside Jack. His demeanor transformed. He was no longer a skeptic. He had become a devoted acolyte, acting as a human shield and a personal bodyguard. He barked harsh orders at the other men to keep their heads down, terrified that a stray Japanese round might find the college boy with the mail-order toy. He offered Jack his canteen with a trembling hand. He offered him a cigarette as if it were a religious offering. Suddenly, the boy with the fragile glass pipe was the most valuable tactical asset in the entire platoon. The sergeant began pointing out high-value targets with the fervor of a man who had seen a miracle, a hidden machine gun nest nestled in the dark maw of a cave at 600 yards.
It shouldn't be possible.
A sniper, concealed in the leafy canopy of a breadfruit tree at 500. He was feeding the beast, and Jack went to work with cold, clinical efficiency. For the next hour, the valley became a laboratory for long-range destruction. Jack conducted a masterclass in the art of the impossible, targeting assets the infantry couldn't even see, let alone touch. He sent a round through the narrow aperture of a reinforced bunker, silencing the gunner within. He shattered the leg of a mortar tripod with a single shot, toppling the weapon into the dirt. He wasn't just killing soldiers, he was methodically dismantling the enemy's entire defensive architecture, one piece of steel and flesh at a time. The unertl scope, despite its absurd length and its terrifying fragility, was proving to be the perfect instrument for the static, grinding attrition of Peleliu. Its high magnification allowed Jack to peer deep into the deceptive shadows of the caves, to catch the momentary muzzle flash of a hidden rifle. and to discern the subtle patterns of camouflage netting that otherwise blended perfectly with the jungle. However, the improvised, MacGyver nature of the weapon soon began to reveal its limitations under the equatorial sun. The heat was a physical weight, relentless and unforgiving. The steel barrel of the Springfield became so hot it would blister skin upon contact. Violent heat waves began to radiate off the metal, shimmering directly in front of the objective lens and distorting the target image into a wavy, funhouse mirror distortion. To continue the hunt, Jack had to innovate. He tore a strip of burlap from a nearby sandbag and wrapped it loosely around the barrel to disrupt the rising heat currents. He scavenged a piece of cardboard from a discarded K-ration box, fashioning a crude sunshade for the lens and securing it with sticky medical tape from a corpsman's kit. He looked utterly ridiculous, a filthy, sweat-drenched Marine holding a rifle encrusted in rags and cardboard, but the makeshift engineering worked. The optical picture cleared, the distortion vanished, and the systematic killing continued unabated. By noon, the Japanese command finally grasped the horrific reality of their situation. These were not random deaths, and there were no stray bullets. They were being erased by a single, invisible point of origin that defied all their tactical training. The ghost of the 1903 Springfield had arrived, and the valley of Peleliu would never be the same. The ridgeline, once a target-rich environment for the young marksman, had abruptly transformed into a haunting, desolate ghost town where the only movement was the shimmering heat haze dancing off the jagged coral. The Japanese forces were being systematically picked apart by a single, unseen shooter. And they did exactly what any highly disciplined, battle-hardened army would do under such lethal pressure. They adapted with chilling efficiency. They stopped showing themselves entirely, retreating into the labyrinthine shadows of the island's geography. No one stood up to scout. No one dared to peer through binoculars from the safety of the peaks. They stayed deep within their interconnected caves and reinforced tunnels, effectively nullifying the sniper's advantage. The easy targets, the careless officers, and the exposed messengers were gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. But this was not a retreat, it was an escalation. The Japanese commander in the sector, a man trained in the nuances of attrition warfare, quickly realized that standard small arms fire was insufficient to reach or suppress the hidden American sniper. To eliminate a surgical threat, he decided to employ a sledgehammer. Jack heard the terrifying sound long before he saw the source of the danger. It was a deep, rhythmic, and guttural thumping, a mechanical cadence that sounded like a giant hitting a hollow, metallic log with a massive sledgehammer. Thump, thump, thump. It was the unmistakable signature of the Type 92 heavy machine gun, known to the Marines as the Woodpecker for its unique firing rate. "Get down," the sergeant screamed, his voice cracking with urgency as he tackled Jack into the jagged bottom of a coral depression. A terrifying line of explosions began to walk across the ridgeline, shattering the ancient coral and sending razor-sharp splinters of rock flying through the air like lethal shrapnel. This was not random suppressive fire. The Japanese were using the heavy weapon, firing 7mm rounds from a concealed position over 1,000 yards away, with the precision of a sniper rifle. They were walking the fire directly toward Jack's nest, having triangulated his exact position from the subtle muzzle flashes of his previous shots. Jack curled into a tight ball, hugging his Springfield rifle to his chest with a desperate intensity. Curiously, he wasn't worried about his own skin in that moment of impending death. He was absolutely terrified for the integrity of his scope. He knew that if a single piece of flying shrapnel struck that thin steel tube or cracked the delicate unertl glass, his war was effectively over. He wrapped his entire body around the weapon, shielding the optics with his own flesh and muscle. Acting as a human sandbag, the explosions walked closer with agonizing deliberation. Boom, boom. Dust and pulverized limestone covered them in a thick, gray shroud. The acrid smell of cordite and burnt minerals choked the air, making every breath a struggle. The young sniper had kicked a hornet's nest, and now the hornets were swarming with vengeful, high-caliber intent. Then, as abruptly as the bombardment had begun, the firing stopped. The dust slowly settled, revealing a landscape changed by the violence. Jack immediately checked his scope with trembling fingers. It was coated in a layer of fine gray dust, but miraculously, the lenses were intact. He blew the debris off the glass and checked the mounts. They were still tight, holding the zero that his life depended on. He began to crawl back up to his firing position, driven by a stubborn refusal to be silenced. But the sergeant's hand clamped firmly onto his boot. "We have to move." "Kid," the sergeant hissed, his eyes wide with the realization of their vulnerability. "They have this spot dialed in perfectly. Next time they won't use machine guns, they'll use mortars. And we won't survive a direct hit." Jack shook his head, pulling his boot free with a sharp tug. He knew the sergeant was logically correct, but he also possessed a piece of information the older man didn't. The heavy machine gun team had just made a fatal mistake. They had revealed their position during the final burst. The muzzle flashes had originated from a dark, subtle slash in the dense jungle canopy, far back on the second ridgeline. It was a staggering distance, 1,000 yards out, perhaps 1,100. In the world of 1,944 ballistics, it was considered a suicide shot. The bullet would have to drop nearly 30 feet during its flight to hit the mark. The official manual stated the effective range of the Springfield was roughly 900 yards for a point target, and they were well beyond that mathematical limit. Jack settled the rifle back onto the sandbags, his mind racing through the variables of wind, humidity, and gravity. He didn't bother adjusting the mechanical knobs this time. The scope simply didn't have enough internal elevation adjustment for a shot of this extreme magnitude. He would have to rely on Kentucky windage, a primitive yet effective method of aiming where the shooter holds the crosshair high above the target, aiming at a specific tree branch or a passing cloud, essentially guessing the trajectory's arc. He looked through the scope, finding the dark slash in the green abyss. He saw a feint, the momentary glint of metal where the heavy gun was hidden in the shadows. Jack shifted his aim, centering the crosshairs on a patch of empty blue sky, 20 feet above the gun position. To any observer, he was aiming at nothing. He was aiming at the air itself. He exhaled a long, slow breath, trusting the cold math and the clarity of his glass pipe. He squeezed the trigger, and the rifle kicked against his bruised, aching shoulder one more time. The bullet began its long, lonely arc across the valley, a spinning shard of lead flying toward a target Jack couldn't even see within his field of view. The bullet remained in the air for 2 full seconds, a duration that, in the world of high-stakes ballistics, feels like a lifetime. In 2 seconds, a man can stand up, take a step, and sit back down. The .30 caliber projectile, spinning at over 200,000 revolutions per minute, was fighting a losing battle against atmospheric resistance. It had left the muzzle at supersonic speed, but as it crossed the 1,000-yard threshold, it was rapidly slowing down. It was entering the treacherous transonic zone, that unstable velocity where a bullet starts to wobble and lose its gyroscopic stability as it drops below the speed of sound. If it wobbled, it would miss by yards. If a stray gust of wind touched it now, it would be pushed feet off its intended course. Jack wasn't just shooting at a target anymore. He was throwing a ballistic Hail Mary into a hurricane of uncertainty. He didn't see the impact through the scope because the heavy recoil had knocked his sight picture too high. By the time he muscled the rifle back down into position, the event was over. He saw only the indifferent jungle canopy. He held his breath, every nerve ending screaming, waiting for the inevitable return fire that would tear his position apart. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. 10 seconds. Silence. The rhythmic, terrifying thumping of the Japanese heavy gun did not return to the valley. A sudden, wild cheer erupted from the spotter crouched next to him. The sergeant was pounding Jack on the back with enough force to bruise, shouting that he had seen the gun crew scramble in a panic. He had seen the primary gunner slump over the receiver, his body limp. The round had dropped out of the sky at a steep, plunging angle, entering the open machine gun nest like a miniature mortar shell. It was a 1-in-a-million shot. A perfect marriage of skill and the kind of luck that only exists on a battlefield. The toy had silenced a heavy weapon that was pinning down an entire company of Marines. But the silence that followed was a deceptive trap. Jack had been operating from this exact same position for nearly 2 hours. A lifetime in sniper terms. He had fired over 20 rounds, killed high-ranking officers, silenced gunners, and neutralized enemy snipers. He had become the single biggest tactical problem for the Japanese on this sector of the battlefield, and on the blood-soaked soil of Peleliu. When you became a significant problem, the Japanese didn't just send more infantry, they sent everything they had left. The ground beneath Jack began to shake with a rhythmic intensity. It wasn't the sharp crack of an explosion this time. It was a low-frequency vibration that rattled the very teeth in his skull. A mechanical grinding noise. The sound of metal protesting against metal echoed up from the valley floor. The Marines in the nearby trench went deathly pale, their eyes wide with a recognition of impending doom. They knew that specific sound, the sound of steel tracks crushing ancient coral into powder. Tanks. Someone screamed. The word carrying a payload of pure terror. Type 95 seconds. 2 of them. Jack shifted his heavy rifle across the sandbags, his heart hammering against his ribs as he looked down into the valley. 2 Japanese light tanks were clanking around the bend of the ridge road, emerging like prehistoric monsters from the brush. They were ugly, boxy machines, painted in jagged yellow and brown camouflage that mimicked the island's terrain. They looked small and almost fragile compared to the massive American Shermans, but against infantry equipped with no anti-tank weapons. They were invincible gods of war, their 37mm main guns swiveled with predatory intent, searching for targets, while their hull-mounted machine guns began to spray the American lines with reckless, unbridled hate. The infantry opened up with everything in their arsenal, but it was an exercise in futility. Garand rounds pinged harmlessly off the steel armor like hailstones on a tin roof, and grenades exploded uselessly against the thick tracks. The tanks ignored the small arms fire entirely, rolling straight toward a critical gap in the American lines, intent on overrunning the command post and turning the tactical retreat into a slaughter. Jack felt a cold, heavy knot of dread settle in his stomach. His rifle, his precision instrument, was utterly useless here. Firing a .30 caliber bullet against tank armor was like throwing a pebble at a moving bulldozer. He considered trying for the driver's vision slit, but the slit was a tiny, recessed rectangle of thick ballistic glass, barely 2 inches wide. At 600 yards, with the tank pitching and rolling over the uneven ground, it was an impossible shot even for him. The sergeant was screaming into a radio for a bazooka team, but the bazookas were gone. The crews were dead, or the ammunition had been lost in the initial landings. Jack watched the lead tank with a predator's focus. He noticed that it wasn't fully buttoned up. The commander's hatch was thrown open, and a Japanese officer was standing tall in the turret. Exposed from the chest up, he was shouting orders into a headset, directing the driver with a visible sense of arrogance. It was the same fatal overconfidence the general on the ridge had displayed earlier. They believed the American infantry was completely suppressed and broken. They didn't think anyone would be insane enough to take a deliberate shot at a tank with a bolt-action rifle. Jack centered the crosshairs on the tank commander's chest. The machine was bouncing violently over the rubble, lurching from side to side as it navigated the broken coral. The commander was bobbing up and down like a cork in a violent storm, making it impossible to maintain a steady track. The Unertl scope's field of view was far too narrow for this kind of dynamic movement. Every time the tank hit a rut, the target vanished from the glass entirely. Jack then did something that made the sergeant gasp in disbelief. He reached up and manually dialed down the magnification. He spun the ring on the scope, widening the field of view. The target became significantly smaller, but the picture became wider, allowing him to see the entire vehicle and the rhythm of its movement. He began to study the suspension, watching how it compressed and rebounded over the rocks. Up, down, up, down. He realized he had to time the shot with the mechanical heartbeat of the machine. He had to fire at the apex of the bounce. That split second, where the suspension hung in the air before crashing back down. He led the tank, placing the vertical crosshair 2 feet in front of the commander's face to compensate for the forward motion. He waited for the tank to climb a specific pile of limestone rubble. The nose pitched up sharply, and the commander rose perfectly into the waiting crosshair. Jack fired. The bullet struck the commander in the side of his helmet with a distinct metallic crack. The man disappeared into the dark interior of the turret instantly, as if he had been yanked down by a heavy cable. The tank, suddenly leaderless, swerved violently to the left, crashing into a limestone wall with a deafening grind of metal. The driver, panicked by the sudden spray of blood and the loss of his commander, had jerked the controls in a reflexive spasm. The tank stalled, its engine sputtering and dying in a cloud of black smoke, a sitting duck in the middle of the road. But the second tank didn't hesitate. It roared past its disabled partner, accelerating toward the thin American lines with renewed fury. The hatch on this one was closed tight. There was no commander to shoot, no exposed flesh to target. It was buttoned up, a rolling steel bunker that seemed immune to anything Jack could throw at it. It was 400 yards away and closing fast, its machine gun raking the coral just inches from Jack's head. Jack scanned the machine desperately, his eyes searching for any microscopic weakness in its iron hide. The armor was impenetrable to his rounds, and the tracks were moving too fast to accurately target. Then, he saw it, the only vulnerability left. The vision ports. While the driver had a narrow slit, the gunner operating the main 37mm cannon relied on a separate optic. It was a small, circular glass lens situated right next to the main gun barrel, no larger than a teacup saucer. It was the tank's only eye. If Jack could smash that glass, he wouldn't just be damaging a machine, he would be blinding the beast, rendering its primary weapon useless and halting its deadly advance. He took a breath, smelling the hot oil and diesel of the approaching monster, and settled his eye against the scope for one final, desperate gamble. He wouldn't be blind. He wouldn't be able to aim the main gun. The tank was 300 yards away, a steel leviathan breathing soot and death into the humid Pacific air. The main gun fired with a bone-shaking boom that seemed to displace the very atmosphere of the valley. A high-explosive shell detonated against the jagged trench wall, a mere 10 feet from Jack, showering him in a cascading rain of pulverized coral, suffocating dirt, and jagged shards of hot metal. His ears didn't just ring, they screamed with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. Thick, crimson blood began to trickle from his nose, a physical manifestation of the sheer concussion that had rattled his brain inside his skull. He didn't panic. He couldn't afford to. He wiped the blood away with the rough back of his grime-coated hand and settled back behind the heavy wooden stock of the Springfield. He ignored the persistent ringing. He suppressed the primal fear clawing at his throat. He focused entirely on that tiny people, crystal-clear glass circle. He knew he couldn't use the dope card for this shot. The mathematics of windage and elevation were useless when the target was a moving predator, closing the distance at 20 miles per hour. He had to feel the shot. A zen-like connection between man, rifle, and the atmospheric pressure of Peleliu. He placed the fine crosshair precisely on the glass eye of the tank, the narrow vision slit where the gunner sat, vulnerable, yet encased in iron. He squeezed the trigger at the natural pause between heartbeats. The shot hit the turret, sparking violently off the hardened steel armor just inches from the optic. A miss. Jack worked the bolt with a frantic, mechanical precision. Clack, clack. The brass casing ejected, and he slammed another, 30-0, 6 round into the chamber. The tank was now 200 yards away, its coaxial machine gun chewing through the sandbags in front of him like a giant chainsaw made of lead. The sergeant was firing his Thompson submachine gun at the steel hull, a useless yet magnificent gesture of pure defiance that sent sparks dancing across the tank's face. Jack fired again, this time through the high magnification lens. He saw a distinct puff of white dust erupt right on the optic. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. The tank's turret, which had been tracking their position with predatory intent, suddenly stopped turning. The gunner was blind, trapped in a dark, metal box with no way to see the world he was meant to destroy. The massive main gun froze, pointing harmlessly and pathetically off to the right. The tank kept moving forward on its clanking treads, but it had lost its teeth without the main gun's guidance. It was no longer a precision weapon of war. It was merely a blind, screaming battering ram. The Marines in the trench, witnessing the miracle of the blinded beast, surged forward with a renewed, ferocious energy. They swarmed the vehicle like hornets, jamming grenades into the tracks to break the drive sprockets and firing point-blank into the vision slits. A satchel charge, heavy with high explosives, was hurled onto the hot engine deck. A massive, earth-shattering explosion rocked the entire valley, and the second tank ground to a violent halt, transformed into a burning pyre of oil and steel. Jack didn't stay to watch the tank burn. He slumped back against the vibrating trench wall, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the precious rifle. He looked at the long, slender Untertel scope. The front lens was coated in a thick layer of soot and cordite. The mounts were battered from the concussion, but the glass, the soul of the weapon, was still unbroken. The glass pipe had survived the mechanical onslaught. But the true horror of the battle was only beginning. The destruction of their armored support had not broken the Japanese defenders. It had enraged them, pushing them toward a final, desperate act of sacrificial violence. They launched a banzai charge. It didn't start with a whistle or a flare. It started with a scream that sounded like 1,000 souls being torn apart. 1,000 voices rose from the dark jungle floor in a terrifying unison. Tenno Heika Banzai. The cry, a pledge of loyalty unto death, chilled the blood of every man in the American line. Out of the swirling smoke and the deep, jagged shadows of the ridges, they came, hundreds of them. Soldiers with long bayonets fixed to their Arisaka rifles. Officers waving ancestral swords that caught the dying light. And men with landmines strapped to their chests, ready to become human bombs. They were running straight into the concentrated fire of the American guns. A human wave of desperate, unstoppable violence. Fixed bayonets. The captain screamed over the din of the screaming and the gunfire. The Marines locked their long steel blades onto the ends of their garrons with a series of metallic clicks. They braced their boots against the crumbling trench wall, their knuckles white. They knew what was coming. This wouldn't be a battle of ballistics and optics. It would be hand-to-hand combat, brutal, intimate, and sickeningly bloody. Jack looked down at his Springfield. It had a bayonet lug, but mounting a bayonet on a rifle equipped with a 2-foot-long precision target scope was absolute insanity. The violent vibration of stabbing someone, the jarring impact of steel on bone, would shatter the delicate internal lenses of the Unertal. In a melee, the long rifle was a liability. It was too long for the cramped confines of the trench, too heavy to swing quickly, and far too fragile for the chaotic geometry of a bayonet fight. Jack made a split-second decision born of tactical necessity and a strange, protective love for the instrument. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, oil-stained wrench. With trembling, sweat-slicked fingers, he loosened the thumb screws on the scope mounts. He slid the Unertal scope off the rifle with practiced grace. He didn't just toss it aside into the mud. He wrapped it carefully in its canvas case, protecting the glass from the elements, and shoved it deep under the heavy sandbags at the bottom of the trench. He buried it like a sacred treasure, a relic of a more civilized form of warfare. Then, he stood up. He was no longer a specialist or a sniper. He was just a rifleman now. He had a bolt-action rifle with simple iron sights and 5 rounds of lethal intent in the magazine. He looked at the sergeant, whose face was a mask of grim determination. The sergeant nodded. They were no longer sniper and spotter, separated by a hierarchy of skill. They were just two Marines in a hole, waiting for the wave of humanity to crash over them. The first Japanese soldiers reached the concertina wire, their bodies becoming a bridge for those behind them. The Browning machine guns tore them apart in rhythmic bursts. But more kept coming, climbing over the mounting piles of the dead with a terrifying, singular focus. They were 50 yards away, then Dreisig, then seen. Jack fired his iron-sighted rifle as fast as his hands could work the bolt, the mechanical rhythm becoming his only reality. He dropped a man at 20 yards with a shot to the chest. He dropped another at 10, who was mid-leap. Then the wave finally crashed into the trench with the force of a physical blow. A Japanese soldier with a fixed bayonet jumped over the parapet, landing with a heavy thud right on top of Jack. The impact knocked the wind out of his lungs, leaving him gasping in the mud. The soldier raised his rifle to stab downward, his eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and zeal. Jack reacted on pure instinct, bringing the heavy walnut stock of the Springfield up with both hands, smashing it into the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The wood groaned under the impact, but the man fell back into the slurry of mud and blood. Jack scrambled to his feet, his fingers already cycling the bolt for the next round. He fired from the hip, the muzzle blast singeing the fabric of the soldier's uniform as the bullet found its mark. The trench had become a literal slaughterhouse. Men were wrestling in the knee-deep mud, stabbing with knives, gouging at eyes, and screaming in a dozen different tones of agony. It was primal chaos, a regression to a Stone Age level of violence where the only rule was survival. There was no strategy here, no windage adjustments to calculate, no complex ballistics to consider. It was just kill or be killed in the dark. Jack fought with the animal desperation of a cornered predator. He used the heavy rifle as a club, the steel butt plate becoming a hammer. He used his trench knife when the space became too tight to swing the long gun. He fought until his arms felt as heavy as lead and his lungs burned with the acidic air of the battlefield. And then, as quickly and as violently as it had started, the madness ended. The wave broke against the shore of American fire. The surviving Japanese soldiers, realizing the charge had failed, retreated back into the thick, sulfurous smoke of the jungle. The trench was no longer a defensive position. It was a grave filled with the dead and the dying. Jack sat down on a splintered ammo crate, gasping for air that tasted of copper and cordite. He was covered in a thick layer of mud and the blood of men whose names he would never know. His knuckles were split and raw. He looked down at his rifle, the weapon that had been his lifeline. The beautiful walnut stock was gouged and splintered. The finish was scratched by the coral and the steel. It looked like it had been dragged through a meat grinder. Suddenly, he remembered the scope. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain in his joints, and dug frantically through the heavy sandbags. He pulled out the canvas case, his heart racing. He unwrapped it with shaking hands, fearing he would find only shards of glass. But the Unertel scope was there. It was clean. It was safe. He held it up to the fading light of the Pacific sun. The glass was clear, reflecting the red sky. The crosshair was still there, perfect, fine, and indifferent to the carnage around it. The sergeant limped over, his uniform torn and his face a mask of exhaustion. He had a crude bandage wrapped around his head, the white fabric already soaking a deep, dark red. He looked at the scope, then at Jack, and for a long time, neither man spoke. The silence was more profound than the noise of the battle had been. The sergeant finally reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes, and offered one to Jack with a steady hand. "You keep that thing safe, kid," the sergeant said, his voice raspy and hollow from the smoke and the screaming. "We got a lot of work to do tomorrow, and the brass is going to want results." Jack nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. He carefully remounted the scope on the battered, scarred rifle, aligning the mounts with a precision that seemed out of place in the ruins of the trench. He tightened the screws until they were snug. He checked the slide, ensuring the optic could move under recoil as it was designed to do. It was ready. The battle for Peleliu wasn't over. It was merely transitioning into a different kind of hell. The ridges above them were still full of hidden caves, and the enemy was still watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. But the Marines had an answer now. They had the glass pipe, and more importantly, they had the man who knew how to use it to reach out and touch the untouchable. The sun began to set over the vast, indifferent Pacific, turning the sky a deep blood red that matched the color of the coral. Jack Miller sat in the ruins of the trench, meticulously cleaning the lenses of his scope with a small piece of silk, preparing for the next hunt, the training toy. The mail-order telescope that had been the butt of so many jokes had officially graduated. It was a weapon of war now, a cold and efficient tool of precision, and it was hungry for more. The battle for Peleliu was originally supposed to last only 3 days, a quick amphibious assault followed by a mop-up operation. Instead, it lasted 2 grueling months. The 1st Marine Division was chewed up and spit out by the Umerbrogel Pocket, a labyrinth of limestone and death. Regiments that went into the fight with 3,000 men came out with fewer than 1,000 effective soldiers. But through the long weeks of grinding, attrition, and soul-crushing heat, one thing changed fundamentally. The laughter stopped. Nobody called the 1903 Springfield a toy anymore. Nobody made jokes about the glass pipe or the fragile telescope that looked like it belonged on a laboratory bench. The weapon had earned a new name among the men who lived and died in the dirt. The infantry called it the Hand of God. It was a fitting title. When a patrol was pinned down by a hidden machine gun nestled deep in a limestone cave, they didn't call for artillery that might take 20 minutes to arrive and hit the wrong ridge. They didn't call for tanks that couldn't climb the vertical, razor-sharp coral faces. They called for the man with the long rifle. They called for Jack. Jack Miller survived the campaign, but he left a significant piece of his soul in those white coral ridges. By late October, the unrelenting heat and the psychological stress of being a professional dealer of death had worn him down to wire and bone. He had stopped counting the kills long ago. The numbers didn't matter anymore. They were just a grim tally of lives extinguished from a distance. It wasn't a competition or a game of skill. It was a job, a grim, mechanical, and necessary job of removing human obstacles so that his friends could walk another 10 yards without dying. The telescope, which had once been pristine and black, was now battered and scarred. The black anodized finish was worn off the adjustment knobs, revealing the dull aluminum beneath. The mounts were scratched from countless crawls through the rocks. But the glass, the essential heart of the system, remained perfect. Jack had protected that optic more carefully than he had protected his own body, shielding it from the rain, the dust, and the impact of falls. He knew with a cold, hard certainty that without the glass, he was just another rifleman in a war that ate riflemen for breakfast. He was the eyes of the company, and those eyes had to stay sharp. When the 1st Marine Division was finally pulled off the line, replaced by the Army's 81st Infantry Division, Jack handed the rifle back to the regimental armorer. It was a strange, hollow moment. For weeks, that heavy piece of wood and steel had been his third arm, an extension of his own nervous system. It had slept next to him in the mud, eaten with him in the brief moments of respite, and saved his life a dozen times over. Now, it was just a serial number on a stained clipboard, a piece of government property to be processed. The armorer took it without a word of thanks, tagging it for cleaning and long-term storage. Jack walked away with empty hands. And for the first time in months, he felt a strange sensation. He felt lighter, but he also felt dangerously naked. The weight of the rifle had been a physical burden, but it had also been a shield, a way to keep the horror of the war at a distance of 8-power magnification. Without it, he was just Jack Miller again, a 20-year-old kid from the Midwest who looked 20 years older than he actually was. Jack returned to the United States in 1945. A survivor of a conflict that had redefined the world. The war ended with a flash of atomic fire that made the precision of a sniper's bullet seem quaint and obsolete. But for men like Jack, The war didn't just turn off like a light switch when the treaty was signed. He went back to his small hometown. He got a steady job at a local lumberyard, moving heavy beams of wood that reminded him of the weight of a Springfield stock. He married his high school sweetheart, a girl who had waited for him through the long silence of the Pacific. He tried to live a normal, quiet life, but the silence of the woods was different now. It was heavy and expectant. When he went deer hunting with his father in the autumn, he found that he couldn't look through a telescopic scope without feeling his pulse spike and his palms grow damp with sweat. He couldn't sit still in a tree stand without subconsciously scanning the horizon for the glint of enemy glass or the movement of a hidden observer. He eventually put his hunting rifle away in the attic and never touched it again. The skills that had made him a hero on the ridges of Peleliu, the incredible ability to slow his heart, to read the subtle nuances of the wind, to calculate the gravitational drop of a bullet over half a mile, were worse than useless in a world of mortgages, grocery lists, and Sunday church services. They were a curse, a reminder of a version of himself he no longer wished to know. But while Jack tried his best to forget, the Marine Corps remembered. The radical experiment with the unertile scopes on the front lines had been an overwhelming, undeniable success. The experts in Washington, the men in polished shoes who had laughed at the very idea of a delicate target scope being used in the mud of combat, were forced to eat their words in the face of the data. The after-action reports from the slaughter at Peleliu and the heights of Okinawa were crystal clear. The scout snipers had absolutely terrified the Japanese forces. They had disrupted command structures by picking off officers, silenced heavy weapons by killing their crews from a distance, and systematically broken the morale of the enemy soldiers who felt they were never safe, even in their deepest bunkers. The training rifle had proven once and for all that precision fire was not a luxury for the elite, it was a tactical necessity for the modern battlefield. The hard-won lessons that Jack and his brothers had learned in the jagged coral ridges became the bedrock foundation of an entirely new military doctrine. The 1903 Springfield, with the unertile scope, didn't simply retire into a museum after World War II. It was far too effective to be discarded. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the Marines didn't hesitate. They dusted off the old wooden crates in the armories. The very same rifles that had hunted in the tropical humidity of Peleliu were sent to the frozen, wind-swept mountains of the Chosin Reservoir. They worked just as well in the sub-zero cold as they had in the jungle heat, proving the inherent robustness of the design. A new generation of young snipers looked through those long, fragile-looking tubes and learned the same hard lessons Jack had mastered. They learned that a single, well-placed shot could stop an entire battalion's advance. They learned that technology, no matter how strange or delicate it appeared, was only as effective as the man behind the trigger. The legacy of the glass pipe goes even further than the battlefields of the mid-20th century. It was the direct ancestor, the mechanical grandfather of every modern sniper system used by military forces today. If you look at a modern Marine Scout sniper rifle, such as the M40A6, it looks like something out of a science fiction movie compared to Jack's simple wooden Springfield. It features a modular chassis made of aerospace-grade aluminum, a sophisticated suppressor to hide the muzzle flash, and a scope with a built-in ballistic computer and night vision capabilities. But the underlying DNA is exactly the same. The concept of a heavy, dedicated match-grade barrel, that started with the target rifles of the 1940s. The idea of a high-magnification optic that could reach out and touch a target past 1,000 yards, that started with the unertile. Even the dope card data on previous engagements taped to the stock is a tradition that snipers still carry on today. The tools have evolved. The materials have changed. But the fundamental math remains the same. The wind still pushes the bullet. Gravity still pulls it down. The human heart still beats. And the sniper still has to find the space between those beats to pull the trigger. Jack Miller passed away in 1998. To the end, he was an old man who loved his grandkids, tended his garden, and hated the loud, unpredictable cracks of 4th of July fireworks. He never bragged about his service. He never told his neighbors that he had once changed the course of a battle by blinding a tank, or that he had killed a Japanese general from half a mile away with a single shot. Most of the people in his town just knew him as the quiet, reliable guy who could fix almost anything with a wrench and a bit of patience. But in the deep archives of the Marine Corps, his story was meticulously preserved. The after-action reports were eventually declassified. The grainy, black and white photos of the men with the long problem. Strange scopes were digitized for future generations. Historians began to piece together the full truth about the mail-order toys that had quietly won the war in the Pacific. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the Marine Corps, you might find a specific display tucked away in a quiet back corner. There, secured behind thick, bulletproof glass, sits a 1903 Springfield. It looks battered and weary. The wood of the stock is dark, stained by years of oil, Pacific rain, and the sweat of a young man's palms. And on top of it, sitting on those seemingly ridiculous, fragile-looking metal mounts, is a Unitertello 8-power scope. Most visitors walk right past it without a second glance. They want to see the massive machine guns, the terrifying flamethrowers, or the modern jet fighters. They look at the skinny, old-fashioned rifle and think it looks like something their grandfather might have used to shoot tin cans off a fence post in the backyard. They don't know the story. They don't know that this toy held the line when the steel tanks were rolling and all hope seemed lost. They don't know that this fragile glass pipe was the only thing standing between a company of terrified Marines and total, bloody annihilation. We tell this story because weapons are ultimately just cold pieces of metal and wood until a human being with courage and skill picks them up. We tell it because the men who carried these rifles were not invincible superheroes. They were just kids from places like Iowa and Nebraska who were given impossible jobs and ridiculed equipment. And yet they found a way to win anyway. They took the mockery of their peers and turned it into a hard-won victory. They took a target rifle designed for the polite, quiet world of civilian competition and turned it into the deadliest, most feared weapon on the modern battlefield. If this story of American ingenuity and cold-blooded precision moved you, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that history still matters in a world of distractions. It tells the system that these stories shouldn't be buried under a mountain of cat videos and gaming streams. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. We are digging through the dusty archives every single week, finding the stories of the underdogs, the forgotten innovators, and the quiet professionals who stepped up when the world was on fire. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. What is your favorite underdog weapon of World War II? Was it the mosquito bomber made of plywood? The grease gun that looked like a cheap hardware tool? Or was it Jack's legendary glass pipe? Let us know your thoughts. We read every single comment you leave. Thank you for watching. And thank you for helping us keep the memory of men like Jack Miller alive for the next generation. They deserve to be remembered, not just as names on a list or numbers in a book, but as the giants they truly were when the world needed them most. The legacy of the 1903 Springfield and the Unitertello scope is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective tool isn't the one that makes the most noise, but the one that sees the truth from a distance. In the end, Jack Miller's story is the story of the Marine Corps itself, taking what you have, making it work, and never backing down, no matter how fragile the glass might seem. This is the history of the long shot, the history of the glass pipe, and the history of the men who turned a toy into a legend.